So, welcome to today's episode of Conversations That Connect with Suki and Tayla from Montague Group. So, today you guys wanted to discuss the art of referencing.
First one, we thought we would discuss reference checks and do reference check methods matter. We've had a few instances lately in personal and work life around sort of references and the different methods of them, and also the impact that another country has on gaining references, I guess you could say. So we had to do some references in the US last week, the week before.
Week before.
Yeah, and it was quite difficult to, number one, be able to get in contact with those references because they were on a completely different time schedule halfway across the world. But number two is that the legislations around giving reference checks in the US is completely different. Well, it's basically non-existent because of the lawsuits that could happen. So that was really interesting to learn that part. And then it got us talking because my partner had to do a reference for somebody as well. And it was just a generic email questionnaire, log on here, tick here, yes, no here. But they didn't get the information that they wanted. So then they had to get a third reference for some reason. So again, that's just wasting time now instead of picking up the phone and having that conversation and getting the right information. And we didn't get the right information from the US references. So then we had to go back, but then we realized the reasons why we didn't. And so, yeah, it's been very interesting with all of the references. So we thought we'd open the discussion today. I popped a poll on LinkedIn asking the hiring managers, does a reference check method matter? And if it does, what's your preference? And we had 71% come back and say definitely a phone call with the reference, which is 100% what we do every time if we can. Obviously, sometimes it is impossible to do. So that we're on the right track with that one, I think. And then 29% said either method is acceptable, and we had 0% with email generic questionnaire. So we just thought that we'd talk about that. It's very relevant, I think, too, with end of financial year coming up, new contracts are coming into play. So reference checks it's kind of relevant to where we are sitting.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting. The question is probably, are reference checks still relevant?
Yeah.
Well, yes, they are, because every client of ours expects a reference check. And even if they don't, we do a reference check. We do 2 reference checks. I think for us, we do a phone call in the very first instance because there's a lot of positives around it. Number one, your referee gives their time to talk to somebody or to provide a reference. And you can provide, there's a lot of automation around the reference side. And I get it because it's a process that needs to happen. But I think it's quite an important process because it can make or break a position that you're applying for. And we've had instances where a client would say, how did this person get along with their team members? Did they work on their own, or did they work as part of a team? It's like, they sometimes work as part of a team, sometimes on their own. And you get a feeling like there's something deeper.
Yeah.
On a phone call, you can explore that. You can ask the question, was there any issues? Was there a problem? Oh, no. Actually, they moved teams quite regularly and actually were able to fit into the teams very easily every time. So good resilience, great people skills. If it was a written reference, I don't know, maybe you would have had, okay.
Yeah.
There's no explanation. You can't actually delve deeper and find out the reason. We also have one of our questions, which is the classic question, rating a candidate out of 10. with 10 being the highest on how they performed in that specific role they did. We do sometimes get people that give a 10, because you'll get a reference that is just, yes, great, fantastic, perfect. Yes, I would absolutely hire them again. What would you give them out of 10? Oh, an 8. Like,
Hi.
not a 10? No, because nobody gets a 10. Like, okay. Well, that's relevant, because if nobody gets a 10 and there's always room for improvement, then actually you're giving them an 8 out of 9.
Yeah.
So you can clarify that, but if you have just a written form, it's an 8.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, if everything's so great, why do you just give them an 8 or a 7? Or so you can clarify that. It's and then from our side, it's a benefit to speak to a hiring manager that gives a reference, because they're a hiring manager. So as a recruitment consultant, that's another contact that you build up a connection with, and you can say, well, we've just recruited this position. We know that the guy that's working for you or that worked for you is moving on. We've just had this massive pool of really amazing candidates. Can we help you fill a position? So you're building up a connection, which is that business development side.
Yeah.
Like Taylor said, we don't, 99% of the time we do phone references. When it's different time zones across the globe, it's difficult.
Yeah.
But it seems to me like it becomes more and more just a tick box.
100%. And with the phone call as well, just to add to that, Suki, you get to know the person's tone, like when they're talking about, and I've had this as well, like if you do a reference check and they're like, oh, I would love to give a reference, and the tone's quite upbeat and it's positive, so you're like, oh, I understand what impact this person had on your team, like you get that tone from them. And other times it's like, oh yeah, like he was okay, and then again you explore it, so you get to know the tone behind it, which can also make or break a reference as well.
And which gets lost if it gets lost if it's just a written reference.
They could say that they're great, but really their tone, they're like, oh, they were great. Or they could say, oh yeah, no, he was great. Like the different tones also plays a part in it too. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you don't know whether that reference, you have to go off who that person is suggesting to you, and whether that's a truthful reference or not, you can't, just have to go off what they say too. So, and that's another, I guess, way that people can get around doing the dodgy on a reference check. If you're not calling them, you can just send it to anyone, and they could say that they're anything. But usually with a phone call, you can kind of get to the bottom of it, and you know, they could be talking some dodgy stuff within the phone call, so you can kind of pick up on that, whether this person's legit or not. But on a generic questionnaire, you there's no way, you don't know if that person is actually that person.
And we always ask our candidates, because we know that referees give their time. So we will always say to a referee or a candidate, contact your referees, tell them that we will be calling, and ask them when it will be convenient. So we lock in a time that suits the referee, because we appreciate the time that they provide to give the reference. And a reference can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes max. But it's time that they give out of their day. And I know some people prefer emails because they answer an email after 1 o'clock in the evening. So I completely understand that as well. But I just think from finding as much information as possible. I had a very interesting scenario many years ago where we had a candidate provide 2 referees. First reference was brilliant, great candidate. And my experience of the candidate, the whole process through, was very positive as well. A second reference was, wouldn't rehire him, wasn't good at his job. No. It was a really bad reference. So 2 completely opposite references. I rang the candidate and said to him, I'm not going to tell you which referee, but one of the two that you've provided, they're complete opposites. Can you give me a third reference so I can do a third reference to counter either one of these? So either one of these are correct. My gut is saying the positive one is correct, but I'm doing a third reference to check. And in that phone call, the candidate said to me, out of the two referees that gave you the bad one is this reference. And I said, well, why do you say that? He's like, well, I've just had a phone call from this person offering me a job.
So bad.
They realized when I rang for a reference that he is back on the market. They gave him a bad reference so that they can go in and offer him a job again, which was quite interesting because that same referee, when he left the employment of that person, they wrote him a reference on LinkedIn, which was a beautiful reference. So it contradicted what they had said in the reference to me. But again, if I had just done a typed email one, what would have happened? I don't know. So I've learned through the years that if you can do a phone reference and speak to people, it's just
100%. And I know, hand on my heart, if I have a conversation with someone about that person and I then know, yep, I've done the right things, I've had the conversations with the candidate, with the references, I can, hand on my heart, trust this person to be able to do the job.
correct.
That's so
100%.
important. Like, yeah, just thinking about what you just said, people out there playing these games.
Yeah,
correct. And you never know if it's just an email, you don't know. If I had that as an email and I had two references, I still would have done a third. I still would have checked. But that doesn't say that that's automatically what would have happened.
well, exactly. And in these big corporations that are generally doing these generic questionnaires, they don't necessarily have the time. Making a phone call does take time. It takes, if you're doing two references, that's half an hour. If you have 10 candidates, like for those big corporations, that's like, you could take up, you could have one person that their job is just to do reference checks. So I get that it is time consuming, but if you're a really good candidate and you get a really bad reference because somebody is playing the game, they don't have time to go back out and ask those extra questions. They'll just go, oh, bad reference.
Move on. Yeah, correct. And as a candidate, you will never know that somebody gave you a bad reference. If nobody tells you, you wouldn't know that. So yeah. So it just came up this last week or two where we just reference checking, just the age-old reference check that hasn't changed in decades, just came back up, and we're like, well, maybe it's time just to do a little bit of a talk around that. It'll be really interesting to see where the poll lands.
Yeah, we've still got a few days left on that as well.
Correct.
Yeah. People don't speak about it much. I do think it's very relevant, actually.
It's a huge part of recruitment and making the right hire.
Correct.
Yeah. Make sure your references are people you can trust to have your interests at heart, I think, as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Geez, another example of how you conduct yourself in business really matters.
Yes, correct. Comes back around. Correct. That's us. That's the reference checking side.
So that's it for today's episode of Conversations That Connect with Montague Group. To join past and present conversations, make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify, and let us know what you would like to chat about next.